trail and ultra runners, what is going on? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I am your humble host, Coach Jason Koop, and this episode of the podcast attempts to demystify something that has gotten a lot of attention and hype recently in endurance communities, and that is double threshold workouts. The ability for you to take one workout that you would normally do in one session, break it up into two different sessions throughout the day, and the potential advantages that that might have on any particular athlete. This style of training can be rolled up into a greater philosophy of lactate controlled training, which is sometimes referred to as the Norwegian method, and it has certainly garnered the imagination and attention of a lot of elite and recreational endurance athletes out there. And so I did want to demystify this just a little bit and talk to some people that are on the ground performing research on it. So on the podcast today, we have Rune Talsnes, all the way from Norway. He works in the Department of Neuromedicine and Movement Science and the Center for Elite Sports Research at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. He wrote a great paper recently on this particular subject and attempted to peel back the curtain on how athletes actually react to these two different styles of training. One of them being you're doing one hard single session, and the other one being you're going to break that session up into two individual sessions, and what is going on underneath the hood, so to speak. We then take this podcast and we start to speculate a little bit about what types of athletes might benefit from this and what types of scenarios, what might we actually use this training intervention. As always, there's no hype or hyperbole. We're just presenting the data and his research as it is. All right, folks, with that out of the way, I am getting right out of the way. Here is my conversation with Rune Talsnes, all about double threshold workouts. All right, Rune, first off, welcome to the podcast, coming all the way to us from somewhere in Europe, Sweden, Norway. Where are you coming to us from?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm a Norwegian living in mid Norway in a city called Trondheim, and I work at the university there, the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, where I'm a researcher or a postdoctor. I do research mostly on endurance sports, endurance training, and different topics related to that. And in addition, I also do some consulting or testing of endurance athletes in the Norwegian Olympic Federation.
So I have a question to start out that's kind of unrelated to the paper that we're going to talk about double threshold sessions. But since you're involved in it, and just so the audience can kind of get to know you a little bit better, why is it that sports scientists and athletes from your region of the world are so endurance centric? Like, we get a lot of like interval training theories and interval training research. We have a disproportionate amount coming out of that area of the world as compared to like the US, who has a much more, populous, athlete base to kind of work through. So I was wondering if you could just kind of like peel the curtain back for the listeners a little bit about why that's the case. Why is it just so ingrained in the culture out there, and why do we see so many good athletes and so much good research around endurance training come out of that area?
Yeah, that's a good question and interesting observation, and most likely also really true. I think probably it has different reasons. There are long-standing traditions in Scandinavian countries, like, for example, especially Norway and Sweden, for doing research on human performance, exercise physiology. The kind of pioneers in exercise physiology were from Sweden, and then also in both Norway and Sweden, there are also traditions for kind of a collaboration between academia, research on one side, and then sports practice on the other side. And particularly that is the case in endurance sports, I would say. And there are for sure long traditions as well for endurance sports in Norway. And as probably many are aware of, there are long traditions for cross-country skiing, which is one of the most demanding endurance sports, I would say. So that is probably also a part of the reason for your observation about this interest of endurance training in Scandinavian countries, both in sports practice but also in research.
Yeah, I remember kind of early in my coaching career, a lot of the block style training architecture started to gain just a lot of notoriety and traction within the endurance world. And it kind of came from two facets. Is one, the strength training world, which is neither here nor there, is kind of and not that relevant to what we're going to talk about. But the other piece of it came specifically from cross-country skiers and the research and the practice kind of emanating from that area of the world. So this basis of taking training theory that was either developed or pioneered or at least communicated in that area of the world to the rest of the world has got a long-standing history, and it's always just really fascinating to me that that is the origin of a lot of what that area of the world is an origin of a lot of what we think about endurance training today. So we're going to talk about the next iteration of that, or what time will tell will be the next iteration of that, something that has gotten a lot of attention over the past 2 to 3 years, in a number of different formats, and that's double threshold training. I think the way that this is going to work is we'll spend a little bit of time kind of discussing what it is, just to bring the audience up to speed, and then a whole lot of time talking about how you and some of your colleagues are trying specifically to kind of get a fix on exactly how this type of training not only affects the athlete, but also can potentially promote the adaptive process, which is ultimately what we're concerned about. But just to level set the vocabulary and the strategy for the audience to start out with, in your mind, how would you describe this to an athlete? Athlete comes to you, hey, I've heard about this double threshold training stuff. How would you actually describe that to them, and what would be some of the key like theoretical advantages that you would try to communicate to that athlete?
Yeah. No, I'm not sure where to start, but I guess kind of double threshold training as a concept or method is just performing two sessions of threshold training or moderate intensity training during one day. That is kind of the idea. That is, as you said, kind of have received increased attention over the last years. I don't think I will engage in the debate where this originates from and who started doing it first, but I think
That's fair enough. I don't want you to have to step into those waters as well.
Yeah, I think it's been around for quite a long time, and I've heard that it's been used in kayaking and rowing for many years ago, also in running many years ago. And there's this well-known author in Norway that has written a lot of books on cross-country skiing and sports, and he always says that nothing is new, everything has been tried before, but kind of the context changes, and I think that's the case here as well. It's been around for decades, but as you pointed out, it has got increased attention over the last year, and I think that is particularly due to the use of middle and long distance runners, particularly some Norwegian or some of the world, or at least the world, and some of the best runners in the world, and the Ingebrigtsen brothers, Jakob Ingebrigtsen, has received some attention with that regards, and then it's kind of been adopted to the triathlon and other endurance sports, and this concept probably then also been referred to as kind of the Norwegian method or the Norwegian model, which is this double threshold training specifically, but also threshold training with emphasis on intensity control, intensity steering, particularly by using blood lactate measurements to kind of steer the intensity of the threshold training. All this is somehow related and by many now referred to as the Norwegian method of endurance training.
Well, I'll give the Norwegians the credit for the origin story there, although it's not novel, but maybe we'll give them credit for at least naming it after themselves.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, there are all different types of permutations of this type of workout that you studied experimentally. And I'd be remiss to not mention those, because when you're doing an experimental design, you've got to narrow it down to something, usually a singular thing that you're actually testing. But at its core, a double threshold workout is taking a threshold workout that you could do maximally, something that represents almost the most volume of intensity that you could handle in a session. And the classic way to look at that you've pointed out in your paper is 6 by 10 minutes hard. And breaking that up into two different sessions, a morning session and a night session, by either doing the entirety of that 6 by 10 or some variation of that, which you kind of see in practice. Sometimes it's four intervals in the morning and 2 intervals at night. Sometimes it's 3 and 3. Sometimes it's 4 and 4. And there's all different kind of variations of that. And I think we'll get down to which ones can be more advantageous than others in the dialogue of this. But fundamentally, that's what you're doing, is you're taking something that you would do maximally, or something that represents the maximum or close to the maximum amount of volume of intensity that an athlete could withstand. And you're breaking it up into 2 different sessions that are separated by half a day or an afternoon or something like that. I'd be remiss to mention that I think that threshold training, and this might be a catalyst of it, has kind of got a resurgence, so to speak, over the last few years. It seems that sometimes training theory goes in these waves based on popular opinion. One thing becomes popular, and then another thing gets demonized, and then another thing gets popular, and then another thing gets demonized. And the latest iteration of this is VO2 max training is good and threshold training is bad. And I'm putting those in intentional air quotes, because as practitioners, we usually realize that there's a variety of different intensities. But I was wondering if you could kind of expand on that a little bit, and why specifically what threshold training tries to elicit, and what your opinion is on why we shouldn't think about some of these intensities as necessarily good or bad, that we have to kind of elicit a range of them over the course of an athlete's lifespan.
Yeah, I think that's a good and valid observation. Threshold training has probably also been around for a long time, but
long
as
time.
you say, things they come and goes, and for 10, 15, 20 years ago, it was probably more polarized, the endurance training of endurance athletes. That was kind of either you did low intensity training, that was the focus, or you did more high intensity training or VO2 max training. And then this kind of emphasis on threshold training, kind of intensity zone in between there, where came around, and that has kind of received more attention in different communities and endurance sports. And probably this is also reflected in the research literature, that most of the literature, based on kind of training intervention studies, has been done on emphasizing high intensity training. It's not that much on kind of moderate intensity training, threshold training, and particularly not that much on low intensity training, which often represents 90% of the total training time in endurance sports. So there are kind of different benefits of doing threshold training, and typically I would say it's mostly the argument will be that it acts on kind of your fractional utilization of your VO2 max or your threshold intensity, threshold pace, anaerobic threshold, or critical speed or critical power. But also at the same time, it's hard to separate that kind of low intensity training and target those adaptations, threshold training, target those adaptations, and high intensity training or VO2 max training, target those adaptations. They're kind of all overlapping and are contributing to developing high endurance, aerobic endurance capacity. So the question always is not if you're going to do one or the other, but it's about kind of finding the right balance between different endurance training intensities and find the right balance between training load and recovery, and also kind of the periodization of this training. Typically, you have more low intensity training, moderate intensity training, or threshold training in your preparation period, and then when the competition season are coming closer, then you kind of increase more emphasis on high intensity training and speed training. So, and also it depends on the sport that you're doing. What are the kind of the demands of the endurance sport you're doing? What type of athletes are we talking about? Different approaches with regards to threshold versus high intensity training is probably different training that you need if you're a junior athlete compared to kind of a senior athlete at an elite level. So the context matters.
So try to set this up for the audience. If what I'll call regular threshold training targets a very specific aspect of an athlete's physiology, what's different, or what is the advantage for taking that threshold training session and splitting it up into two different sessions? Like, just from a theoretical or philosophical training architecture standpoint, you've got this one session and you say, no, we're going to, instead of doing this one session, we're going to do these two sessions. What are the advantages that we think might be going on by using that type of training structure?
Yeah, I guess you can get different answers on this one depending on who you ask, of course, but there are different aspects that have been addressed with regards to this double threshold concept. And I guess the aspect that is being mentioned the most is that if you kind of have a certain volume of threshold training that you want to perform, and you do that in two shorter sessions compared to one longer session, then you will kind of achieve a lower training stress and potentially lower recovery time per session. And then maybe over a longer time period, for example, a week or a month, then you can obtain a higher total volume of threshold training by doing it this way. That is kind of one aspect of it, given that it is performed kind of at the same external intensity or like pace, speed, or power output. Another aspect that is often mentioned is that particularly in running, if you split the session up to two shorter sessions, then you kind of have lower mechanical loading per session and a lower injury risk maybe, and also from kind of a more molecular or adaptive signaling context. If you have two sessions in one day, you kind of provide two signals for molecular or two molecular signals for adaptations during one training day compared to one session and one signal. So at least that is kind of a few aspects that have been mentioned. And also, if you do two shorter sessions, as I said, they will probably cost less with regards to internal intensity, for example, heart rate or blood lactate levels or RPE. And then you can also probably compensate by having a higher external intensity for example, speed or power, by splitting it into 2 shorter sessions. And then you allow for performing more threshold training closer to your actual competition speed. That could also be an aspect of this. But as I said, with regards to endurance training intensity and endurance training intensity distribution, it's not kind of, the question is not if you should do double threshold training or not. Probably the answer is kind of finding the right balance between doing one longer session per day, and then sometimes you can do 2 shorter sessions in one day and use this concept as a tool that you have in your toolbox. And what you can lose in a way of doing it as 2 shorter sessions compared to one longer session is that if you have a longer session, you typically achieve duration dependent increase or drift in internal intensity measures, like heart rate drift, and increase in lactate or RPE, and the physiological stimuli and cost of the session is higher. And then you might also achieve kind of one larger or higher signal for adaptations, particularly through glycogen depletion. So there are probably pros and cons of doing double threshold training compared to fewer and longer sessions. And this concept can, as I said, be a tool that you can use together with performing some longer sessions, I would say.
Rune, that was really well articulated. I think for all the coaches out there, if you just rewind 3 or 4 minutes and bullet point each one of those, almost like a pros and cons list that you went through, I think that that's a really good exercise to go through when designing training architecture, because everything that you do will have a slightly different, or could potentially have a slightly different effect on the adaptive process that you're ultimately trying to elicit. And how you tune those individual workouts and the whole milieu of workouts that you prescribe for an athlete has to be discrete and very specific towards what the athlete actually needs. And here you have something that looks on paper, where it looks on paper at least, where it could be it could be the same. You have 6 10-minute intervals, and in one scenario they're all done at once. In another scenario they're split up in 2 sessions. It's not that that's the only variation of it, but if you do start to do that, you start to see subtle differences in the way that the athlete actually physiologically reacts to that. And that's exactly what you decided to test. And I'll leave it to you to kind of describe the specific paper that we're going to talk about in just a little bit. I'll leave a link to it in the show notes, but the title is Comparison of Acute Physiological Responses Between 1 Long and 2 Short Sessions of Moderate Intensity Training and Endurance Athletes. I'll use that as a little bit of setup and throw it over to you. Describe like the experimental condition that you're creating, and then what were the key takeaways from it?
Yeah, I can try that. As I said, this concept of double threshold training has probably been around for several decades, but it's not received any attention in the research literature. So this was kind of the first study on this topic and this concept. And it's not kind of a training intervention study that really does say anything about the actual training effects of doing double threshold training versus not doing it. But the purpose was to kind of have a starting point and try to understand this concept better. So we kind of did a more observational study where we measured the acute physiological responses of doing double threshold training compared to the same time and intensity matched session as one long session. So that was kind of the purpose of the study, and we recruited 14 national level cross-country skiers in Norway to do this, and they, in a counterbalanced order, they all performed one day of 2 interval sessions, and those were kind of 3 times 10 minutes per session, and then the other day was 1 single session with 6 times 10 minutes intervals. And this was treadmill running in the laboratory, and during the sessions we measured kind of different physiological measures, so heart rate, blood lactate levels, rating of perceived exhaustion, oxygen uptake, ventilation, and then also after the sessions were performed, we had the participants in the lab for 1 more hour and measured kind of their heart rate recovery during that hour post-exercise. And we also had some questionnaires both directly after the sessions were performed on kind of how they perceived the exhaustion, the training quality of the sessions. And we also had this questionnaire on kind of perceived training stress and recovery that they filled out the morning after the training day. So that was basically what we did. Relatively simple study design and measurements, just the kind of acute responses, but this hopefully serves as a starting point in this topic, and might generate some kind of hypothesis for further work and maybe some future training intervention studies. And it's also the case in the research literature on endurance training that a lot have been emphasized towards the interaction between training volume and intensity, but there's not that much research and scientific understanding of the interaction between training volume and frequency. It's mostly emphasized on intensity. So that was basically what we did in the study.
It's almost like you get what you expected, right? So you have one session that was that when you study the subjects during the session and after the session, 6x10 is I'm gonna kind of bastardize the results here. That one session is harder, right, or physiologically more stressful than splitting the 2 sessions up, which is, the audience is going to think about this and like, well, yeah, of course it's not. Like if I go and I do the hardest workout I could possibly do, or a really, really hard workout, of course that's going to be more stressful or more physiologically stressful than if I split it up. And I always feel that studies like this that are looking at the response from the athlete and not necessarily the training effect, or what you call the training effect, well, I'll call the adaptive response, same thing.
Yeah.
It ends up being a little bit of a Rorschach test, right? In terms of if you're coming to the test, or if you're coming and reading the paper through a certain lens, you're going to interpret it that way. And if you come to the paper from a different viewpoint, you're going to interpret it that way as well. So if you're looking at this paper saying, okay, I want to create the most stress as possible, and then that higher level of stress is going to facilitate a greater adaptation, you're going to say, of course 6x10 is better. We're gonna break it up into really blunt categories here, even though we already went through that it's a tool. But 6x10 is better because you're going to get a more robust adaptation because of the higher level of stress. If you look at it from, well, the lower stress is better at the same exact workload, you're going to say, oh, well, breaking the session up is better because you're going to get a similar level of adaptation for less physiological cost. Is that a fair, like, Rorschach analysis of it? Like when you put this paper out in the world, and I'm sure that you saw some of the feedback and the commentary and the dialogue that revolved around it. Is that a fair encapsulation of how you could potentially view the same paper through 2 different lenses?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a fair and good summary of the results in the study. It was definitely not surprising if you kind of have if you do one longer session that have the same kind of volume and intensity, that have a higher physiological cost acutely and potentially a higher recovery demand, than splitting it up into time and intensity matched shorter sessions. So it can kind of be interpreted different ways depending on the lenses that you put on, as you say. If you want kind of the highest possible training stress or training stimuli, then you should probably go for doing one longer session. If you want a lower physiological cost and training stimuli acutely, then you should probably split it up to 2 shorter sessions. And both of those kind of scenarios have pros and cons, I would say, and it depends what your goal is and what you want to get out of it. It's probably a combination of both that you should kind of prescribe to your athletes or implement in your training programs. And yeah, it all depends, I would say. There are if you want to accumulate more time over a certain time period, it might be good to have lower cost per session to kind of try to achieve a more consistent training process, sustainable training process with a lower risk in a way. But if you kind of want a higher training stimuli, potentially also more adaptations out of a few sessions, then you should probably go for one longer session where you achieve these kind of physiological drifts during the session.
Yeah, it becomes one of those things that from a coaching and an athlete perspective, that many athletes are going to go down to the pragmatic implementation of either one of those styles. And not to say that you have to do all of one or all of the other or whatever, but because some of the differences might be so incredibly nuanced, it kind of comes down, can you do 2 sessions in a day? Which many athletes either don't want to do, or especially the regular athletes that have like full-time jobs and things like that, they just can't practically pull off. So I don't know if you had any further thoughts on that, or if you can come up with an example of an athlete in a particular event, and you could span the entire endurance sphere, right? An athlete in a particular event, or that needs to elicit a really particular adaptation, would be a more favorable candidate towards one style of doing this or the other. Because what I want to try to communicate is athletes are always trying to achieve something. They know they want to get better. I'm going to take it out of physiology. They want to get better at climbing, right? So they do specific things that make them better at climbing. They know they want to get better at speed. So they do specific things that get better at speed. Is there an athlete prototype or an event prototype that in your mind would favor one style of doing this type of work versus another?
Yeah, it's also a good question. I would say it's as you said, it probably depends a bit on the athlete, what kind of profile the athlete have, and then it also depends on the sport in a way, what kind of demands that the sport includes. For example, in road cycling, where you have long durations and long competition time, it's maybe not that relevant. But in running, it might be, at least in middle and long distance running, it might be more relevant because you want to accumulate more time at threshold or do more threshold training, and this might be a method to obtain that. And also by reducing mechanical loading per session. Cross-country skiing, triathlon, you have the possibility to change between different exercise modes. So you can also then do different exercise mode. So have, for example, in cross-country skiing, something that are more lower body in the morning, running, for example, uphill running or something, and then you can do more double poling in the evening that are more loading the upper body, obviously, and then you can by that also tolerate a higher volume of threshold training. And another kind of potential benefit or advantage of doing it is if you try to center your interval sessions or your threshold training in one day or maybe over 2 subsequent days, then you potentially have better time in between there to do more low intensity training or other type of training that you need to prioritize. So that is probably also one aspect of this double threshold concept that is relevant to mention.
So your time at threshold concept actually struck a chord with me, because this is something that we see at the more at the elite end of the spectrum, and to a certain extent kind of like the mid pack for 100K and maybe 80K types of races. I just was telling you offline, I just got back from UTMB, or the whole UTMB races. And CCC is actually a great example of this. It's a 100K race. And for the professional athletes, typically they can do the climbs right around their threshold, and they get a little bit of recovery on the descents. It's not like a cycling race where it's more 0 watts, and the stress is just the stress of the high speed descent and things like that. But my point with that is the way that the race unfolds. 10 people make it over the first climb, 8 people make it over the second climb, 6 people make it over the third climb, 3 people make it over the fourth climb, and then the winner and the podium is kind of determined by the last climb and the descent. And if each one of those climbs is done at threshold, they're anywhere between 20 and 45 minutes or something like that, a very typical threshold type of time or a very typical time where you can elicit a threshold type of intensity. It's not that they can run any one of those climbs faster. It's just they can do more of it. So instead of being able to aggregate 90 minutes, let's say, at threshold intensity, they can aggregate up to 2 hours at that threshold type of intensity, or whatever the domain that we're looking at it is. I view this application through that lens. So in one single session, I might only be able to get 60 or 75 minutes out of an athlete at threshold. If I can somehow rearrange the architecture so that over the course of a day, a week, or a month, they're more exposed to time at that intensity, and then therefore in a race they can operate at that intensity for a longer period of time. That's a performance advantage. It's not necessarily, although this would also happen, it's not necessarily improving that threshold capacity from whatever minutes per mile or minutes per kilometer to a better minutes per kilometer. It's being able to do it for a longer period of time, or do it repeatedly over the course of a race, that I think is kind of the material advantage. That's kind of the first lens that I look at this through, is through just how would that actually play out on a race course. And in my estimation, that's one of the more likely candidates that will eventually kind of get flushed out when we start to look at this more and more.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's a good example of a way to kind of use this double threshold training as a method to target the specific demands in ultra running, because intuitively you would probably think that this is not that relevant for ultra running, because kind of it's long duration events, and this is kind of splitting it into 2 shorter sessions. You probably will have greater benefits of doing longer sessions in ultra running, but to kind of provide a new stimuli for your training, and also kind of accumulating more time at a higher speed or at the threshold, this might then be a method that is interesting to use as a part of your training program. It's not the most important part of your training program, I think, but it might be a tool in your toolbox that you can use. I'm not that familiar with ultra running, but if I understood it correctly, it also, in the beginning of the competitions, the speed is often quite high. So you need some kind of capacity of handling a bit higher speed and maybe a bit higher blood lactate values, and then doing this double threshold training might be a method to practice that more.
Yeah, it's interesting because in sports like cycling, we know very well what the demands of the events are, because we have onboard power meters. That really revolutionized the way that we thought about cycling training, because we could very realistically look at what the external load of a stage in the Tour de France was, a road race, any sort of, any sort of cycling application, became a really good window into that. We don't really have a very good equivalent of that in trail and ultra running. We can guess by looking at heart rate and normalized graded pace and even perceived
Mm.
exertion and things like that, and start to try to alchemize, okay, how hard are they running during any one particular race? And this is just when I say an athlete can do this in this situation, right? I just mentioned the CCC example.
Mm.
That's just based off of my observation of looking at training files and watching how the races unfold and trying to dig into whatever data I can, what's actually out on the course. And I think that's a realistic level of accuracy to try to get to. There might be some window that we ultimately like open up, several years from now that adds more precision to that. But I do think that at the elite level and mountainous 80K and 100K, those athletes are spending a lot of time very, very close to their threshold on these 20 to 40-minute climbs, and that becomes a important kind of an important component of it. Your point that it's not maybe not the most important component of it is really well taken, because that's not the entirety of the race. They still have to descend, they still have to eat, there's still other, things that go into it. It's a really complicated sport that can't just be defined by the intensity on the climbs. But at least for that, like I said, when I look at this type of training intervention, what I'm always trying to slice out whenever I see any of these studies that come out is, okay, now that we know what's going on, how does it ultimately apply? And then how could I potentially incorporate this into an athlete's training program? And when I go through that logical exercise, that's the application that I see sort of emerge.
Yeah, definitely. And I agree on that. I think it's important to emphasize not only in ultra running, but all endurance sports that kind of, although we have done this study on double threshold training, it's a concept that's kind of received a lot of attention over the last years. It's not any magic with it. It's kind of, yeah, in many cases, it is given too much attention and value. It's in a way sort of a hype, and it's nothing magic with that. You can't find any magic training method. It's kind of the important thing is to have a good balance between training and recovery over time, and have a training process that are consistent and that you can do over a long time, and then typically you achieve better adaptations and improvements in performance. So I think also part of this double threshold training might be that if you're going to do 2 interval sessions, threshold sessions one day, maybe you're a little bit more focused in a way. You want to do it even better at intensity steering. Basically your training quality, execution quality of the training will be better because you're so focused of doing this right. You're doing it more in a more systematic manner with better intensity control and so on. That might also be a part of the effect. You should not underestimate the kind of effect of believing in it either. If this is a concept that some of the best endurance athletes in the world are doing, and you start doing it and believing in it, that also kind of have an effect on its own, I would say. So
both of those are really well taken. I like the fact that the person producing the research is trying to tone down the hype on it, like realizing that it's gotten a little bit out of control. I appreciate that about you. So you did this initial study, right, which looks at the acute response, right, between these two styles. Where do you want to take it from here? Because I know that you're intellectually curious. You kind of want to see if there is any magic behind it, right, to use your earlier vocabulary. What do you eventually want to do to try to understand what might be going on further? Like, take us in your 5 years down the line, 3 years down the line, like, what do you want to better understand about this concept?
Yeah, I think, as I said, this is a starting point to better understand the kind of pros and cons of splitting endurance training up to more or frequent sessions. And as I said, also in general in the research literature on endurance training, it's not that much that have been kind of trying to understand this interaction between training volume and frequency. So I think to continue to try to understand that not only in threshold training, moderate intensity training, but also low intensity training, that is 90% of the training time in endurance athletes or 80% of the sessions. And we don't actually know that much about low intensity training. What is the optimal intensity, the optimal duration, frequency, and so on. So continue down that road, both with regards to low intensity training and also threshold training, I think is really interesting and something that you want to continue with. And maybe when we have understood even more about these acute responses of manipulating with training volume and frequency, then we have a hypothesis that we can actually test using a more experimental design or a training intervention study where we actually apply different training models and measure the effect of doing it over a number of weeks that a training intervention study typically lasts. So that will, in a way, be the next step, I think, to see if there's actually some potential differences in the training effect and the performance outcomes.
Yeah, because when you look at how you would do this, like practically, dividing one session into two equal parts is not the only way that you could do it. So to my earlier example, if you know that you can do 6x10 in one session and that's about all you can do, you can squeeze out 4x10 in two sessions, which gives you 80 minutes on the day versus 60 minutes on the day. That's an apples and oranges. That's an apples and oranges comparison. But if you're going to use what I would call time under workload strategy, right? Time under a specific workload is going to be the biggest hammer in on the adaptive process. If that is your viewpoint, how you kind of view a big component of training, then this again becomes more than a reasonable intervention to kind of throw at an athlete, given that they can actually do 2x40 and doesn't cause downstream problems and so on and so forth. So your point is kind of like well taken on that we kind of don't know what these affect. Or we have few guideposts. I would say we don't know, but we have few guideposts in terms of what are effective doses, what are good maximum doses, what are effective minimum doses, and things like that. And using these types of studies to really elucidate that, I think is actually quite helpful. Just your point of what's the minimum level of intensity that you need during an easy workout. That's a really common question athletes have. Is it a heart rate of X? Is it a pace of Y? Like, does it matter if I go 2 hours at a heart rate of 140 versus 120? I'm just throwing those numbers out just to give relative example. Does that actually matter? The fact that we have a little clarity on that, I think it speaks to a lot of what we actually can find out.
Definitely. I agree. It's like in the research literature on endurance training, typically we use 3 intensity zones, kind of low, moderate, and high intensity. And the low intensity zone is from 55% of heart rate max to 82% of heart rate max. Yeah. So where should you actually
That's a big
do
range.
your low intensity training? Yeah, it's a really big range. So we actually don't know that much. So it's definitely more nuanced. And although other intensity zone scales exist and are being used, that is what's most commonly used in the research now. So there are work that could be done in this field to try to understand this better.
Yeah, I'll tell you from ultramarathon perspective, the answer is yes. More of all of it is better. higher heart rate,
Yeah.
bigger training volumes, whatever you want to, more is better. And I use that I use that part in jest, but part in serious, that you can't always apply the more hammer to elicit further adaptation. Sometimes you have to use a little bit more precise tool to do it. And this would be a good,
Yeah.
a very practical use case of that, where you're using a more precise tool.
Yeah.
I appreciate you coming on the podcast today. This is super fun. I can't wait to hear what else comes out of your lab. Before I let you go, how can people find you and a little bit more about your research and the work that you guys are doing over there?
Yeah. No, thank you for having me. It was interesting with a detailed discussion on double threshold training. So hopefully the listener will get something useful out of it. I'm not the most active researcher, I think, on social media, at least compared to many. But you can find me on Twitter or X. Some of my research will be kind of published there, and then ResearchGate, I think, is the best way of finding and getting access to my research. And yeah, I would start there if someone are wondering what else that I have been doing over the last years.
And I'll leave links to all of that, as well as the paper, which is open access. I found it freely.
Yeah, that's true.
So
That's
other
true.
people can, have free access to download it. So I'll leave links to all that in the show notes. Appreciate you
That's true.
coming on today, and we'll have to bring you back once you have step 2, which is
Yeah,
inevitably going to be how do athletes actually get better in one style versus the other.
definitely. I will do that. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, folks, there you have it. There you go. Much thanks to Rune for coming on the podcast today. I always appreciate the insight from people who are actually doing some of this research on the ground and presenting a very practical approach for how we might actually implement these workouts. As I mentioned during the podcast, his paper that we were discussing is open access. A link to that will be in the show notes. Y'all feel free to go and check it out and download it. It is it's a pretty good read, but it's one that leaves you wondering what is actually going to happen to the adaptive process at the end of the day, now that we know what is actually happening to the athletes themselves in terms of fatigue and or recovery. If you like this podcast, there's no Patreon. I ain't got nothing to sell you. There are no affiliate links or anything like that. The only thing you can do is share this with your friends. I always appreciate it when I go out into the community, just like I did over at UTMB a couple of weeks ago, and people come up to me from kind of all corners of the world and tell me how much they appreciate the content within this podcast. So if you like it, you think that either one of your training partners, a fellow coaching colleague, or just somebody that you happen to compete with or against would find this content valuable, please just share it with them and spread the love. That means a whole heck of a lot to me. All right, folks, that is it for today. And as always, we will see you out on the trails.